Let's turn to exploring the Shema discussions on the issues of Trinity and take the next 20 or 30 minutes and continue to work our way through the notes. We're talking about this idea of Unitarian views versus Trinitarian views, and there's really a heavy emphasis in this part of my study on the Holy Spirit. Remember, this is a three-part study that is available on my website at tetzetorah.com, and it's a three-part study that's broken up into those three parts on purpose since it's a Trinity study. The first part deals heavily with God the Father and the identity of God. The second part deals with the nature of Messiah, Yeshua, and the hypostatic union between fully God and fully man. And now we're in this third part where we're talking about who or what is the Holy Spirit. So we just finished looking at this quote. I believe it's from a website, Unitarian.com, or something that. Let's now turn to my study, pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago, and continue talking about this idea of Unitarian and Unitarian thoughts versus Trinitarian thoughts and things like that. I say, and lastly, a lengthy quote from Tim Hegg, and then the late Charles Haddon Spurgeon will close out the section of my commentary. So we're talking about Unitarian versus Trinitarian theology when it comes to the Holy Spirit. All right, so let's look at Tim Hegg's notes. Quote, this is Tim Hegg. Quote, as we have seen, the primary issue faced by the early Christian church as it sought to define the Godhead was how to avoid two opposing errors. On the one side was the need to maintain the infinite oneness of God, that is, to avoid teaching a di-theism or a tri-theism. Okay, so we're talking about the early Christian Greek-thinking fathers, Greek-speaking early church as it began to be heavily populated by non-Jewish members, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? The Holy Spirit was working mightily in those early days with Christian Gentiles. So the Holy Spirit was bringing more and more Gentiles into the family of God. And in their discussions about God, they asked questions that perhaps maybe Jewish believers or Jewish people didn't really think. They kind of just took for granted, but maybe didn't vocalize. Like, what is the scope of God's nature? How is he put together? How is it that Jesus is God, but God is God, and the Holy Spirit is God? And how can you verbalize that? And so there was a time period in the early church when creedal formulas and apologetics were, they were just the order of the day. Heresy was rapidly rising in ranks. Opposition to monotheism, opposition to Yeshua being very God. And so very early on, Arianism was one of the early heresies that was to be combated. And modalism. Remember, Arianism and modalism are just two of the very early heresies. Arianism is the belief that Jesus is not fully divine. He's human, but that's essentially all he is. He doesn't have divinity. He's a creature created by God. He's the highest creation. He's the very first creation of God, but he's a human that's been divinized by God. He's been given God status, but he's nevertheless a human. So he's not equal with God. He doesn't have the same nature as God. He doesn't have the same stuff that God is made up of, right? The homoousion and things like that. So the early Christian church had to deal with that heresy of Arianism. The other heresy that they had to deal with very early on, I think Arianism was one of the first, and the other one that they had to deal with was dynamic monarchianism or modalistic monarchianism, a form of modalism that basically teaches there's only one God, but he reveals himself as in three persons or three masks, three disguises, but there's really only one God swapping out the masks. In other words, Jesus is stripped of his personhood. There's no really whole person of the Holy Spirit. There's just one God, a singular God, but he exists as a soul being that wears these outfits, right? He changes his hats, swaps out his outfits whenever he wants to walk among humans, right? He disguises himself as Jesus, or he disguises himself as the Holy Spirit. So that's really what Tim Hegg's just referring to it, all right? Di-theism and tri-theism. All right.